Welcome to the podcast of the US Seafood Consumer Sentiment Report. We're going to talk about an interesting report we did on US seafood. I'm Matt Craze. I work in the seafood industry. I have a firm called Spheric Research, and we look at all aspects of the seafood industry. And I'd like to introduce the person I'm speaking to today.
Hello, Matt. Yeah, so I'm a marketing and strategy guy, and I work with clients in the food industry in general. And you and I hooked up a couple of years ago to do a lot of work together, and we started investing in developing this report together. So it's been really a fun journey.
Absolutely. And I met George doing a lot of strategy consulting work. And we worked on actually projects across multiple industries. And then I had this specialization going on in seafood, and I sort of slowly pulled George a little bit into the seafood space. George was already has extensive background in the seafood industry. And that's really how we came to think of coming up with this report. So that really brings us to the topic of today, the US seafood market. George, obviously I remember, but why did we get into this thing?
Well, I think this is a surprisingly large industry for one that has not enough focus on the consumer. I think everybody we talk to is interested in production. You know, what are the quantities? What are the pounds? How much is being imported, exported? And people aren't talking about the consumer, and that's where it's at. So we recognize there's a real need. Everybody we talk to has said there's a need, and so it was a great opportunity to satisfy that need. So that's how we started.
No, absolutely. And I came in from I've been involved with the seafood industry more or less. So I'm guessing about 2005, I had my first contact with Norwegian salmon farmers. I was working for Bloomberg. I was a commodities analyst, and then I joined Bloomberg to sort of do the data and information piece on commodities. Seafood slowly came up on the radar. The Norwegians were just beginning to get quite influential. But more lately, the US seafood market has been the most dynamic market, and it's the one that's changing the most. So you have this, typically 10 years ago, we'd think of, for the Europeans, the salmon market would be Europeans eat at home, Americans eat in restaurants, eat seafood in restaurants. And then we had this whole COVID period, and that's sort of flipped around, but we think that it's been changing for a longer period of time.
I think one of the things that we found in this study was really interesting. Firstly, the impact on culinary culture of sushi has been amazing, because virtually any young people, so anyone who's Generation Z or millennials, loves sushi, and that has translated into greater interest in seafood in general. And I think what we saw more recently with COVID is that people had to eat at home. They couldn't go out, and they started overcoming their apprehension about cooking seafood, and they started cooking, not sushi, but cooking seafood at home. And we saw a great lift, and we think that's going to become part of what drives ongoing growth in at-home consumption. It's been very interesting.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's changing really rapidly. So when we did this report, again, George, talk us over a little bit why we thought there's a lot of good information out there about this industry, but there are some gaps too.
Sure.
What were we looking at? What did we think could be done that hadn't been done until now?
Quite a bit. So first of all, if we talk from the quantitative standpoint, the best available data is what is known as scan data. So that is, people go to the supermarket and they pay for something, it's scanned, and that data is added up. And people's opinion about the size of the market is based on that. And what we realized is that actually only represents half of the at-home market. There's a whole entire 50% of the at-home market that is never scanned, because people buy it at small grocers or fishmongers or down at the dock or at certain retailers who don't participate in that. So first of all, there was a quantitative element. And then there's also a qualitative element, which is what's actually in the mind of the consumer. What do they think about when they think of salmon or shrimp or seafood in general? And what thoughts and emotions are they bringing with them into the supermarket? And what is that journey through the supermarket, and how does seafood play into it? So all those pieces were missing in our understanding, the industry's understanding. We thought there was a need to satisfy some of that.
Right. And you brought a specific skill set to this exercise, because obviously, if not, somebody would have done it. So just talk us a little bit through the process of how we approach this in a different way.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I have a marketing strategy background. And when we think about growing any type of industry, any type of business, we always start with the consumer. And I find it useful to do both qualitative and quantitative research, as we did in this report. So we started with interviewing about 60 consumers for an hour each. I mean, you and I both did these interviews, and we figured out really what's in their mind, and we unpicked it. And there was a bit of structure to those interviews. We can talk about that later. And then we did a national quantitative survey of 1,000 consumers, which is representative of race, gender, age across the country. And that allowed us to have the depth of data to really prove some of the hypotheses that we had come up with. So there's a lot of data that goes into this synthesis, which gets produced as a report.
Yeah, I remember that in-depth interview process really well. One of the things that struck me, being a British person, I've spent quite a lot of time in the States, but I don't know it that well. And it was quite interesting that you would interview people from inland states who don't really have much of a relationship with seafood. But then you get people, we were interviewing people in Washington State, and even though they claim that they don't know anything about seafood, they would start talking about all these things that they came from just down the road, right?
It was amazing how many people would say, oh, actually, my grandfather is from Alaska, and he grew up on a fishing boat. And like the people have these connections, particularly coastal people, have these amazing connections to the sea, and it's part of their heritage. And I actually think one of the reasons that we discovered that people on the coast eat more seafood is that I think so many people have some type of personal connection to the ocean. It's really fascinating.
Yeah. And we're right now, we're sat in
outside of Gloucester, Mass. Outside of Gloucester, really.
Boston, but Peabody, which you're lucky you actually know how to say that, because somebody told me the other day. Otherwise, I would have said Peabody.
Well, you don't. Since you're not from here and I am, I'll tell you, we're down the street from Gloucester, Mass. Gloucester is the historical fishing capital of the United States, and it's a small town. It's a small city now, but really a small town that has lost 10,000 men to the sea in 400 years in fishing. And you do the math on that, it's some staggering number. You calculate how many fishermen were lost to the sea, and it's just culturally very important. And so it's appropriate that we're sitting outside of Gloucester today.
Yeah. And I've been going in and out of supermarkets and looking at what seafood they've got on the fresh counter, and I've noticed there's a lot of cod and hake.
Yeah.
Would I find that if I went to another store in an American city, or would it look different? Yeah, we were talking about New England and the fact that in different parts of the States, people eat seafood in different ways. And that's something that for me as a British person, I think in Britain we probably, the seafood consumption doesn't change massively from one area of the country to the next. But here in the States, it seems to have a huge influence on...
It was quite interesting. I mean, the people who live at or near the coast eat considerably more seafood than the folks who are inland. And when people travel to the coast, they eat considerably more seafood when they're at the coast than when they're at home. So there's definitely a coastal element. And one of the things we learned about how people think about seafood is there's just this very deep and colorful association with coastal towns and coastal vacations and so forth.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And it's in a way, it presents a conundrum for the seafood industry in a way where they want to say if they're going to start producing things from, or they're going to start to talk about how aquaculture works and how maybe the shrimp that you're eating doesn't come from just down the road, but it may come from Vietnam, or salmon comes from the Faroe Islands, not from a local river, and people, not everybody seems to know that. So is it a good thing to talk about provenance or not? Because you could potentially boost consumption in inland states if they realize that the modern seafood industry can deliver things to your doorstep super fresh, but on the flip side, you may hurt the other side of the industry.
It certainly is a conundrum, because what we saw is when people start to think a lot about seafood and they start to say, oh, there is such a thing as farmed seafood, there is such a thing as wild caught seafood, they get into this spin where they say, gosh, wild caught, I wouldn't want to be dredging the bottoms of the oceans and killing the ecosystem, so I'm worried about that. But then again, farm seafood, gosh, that sounds really icky, and I've read a lot of stuff that I don't like that very much. And they actually then move away from seafood and say that I just can't face the choice. I'm just going to go to chicken. And so it's interesting that leaving consumers somewhat oblivious to the realities of production may allow them to associate all the positive attributes that they have with seafood and then just consume more. So it's an interesting, as you said, it is a conundrum.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how the segmentation work,
Yep.
which we did, and
Right.
was one of the main things you'll see in the report is how we've basically managed to size up the market, diced up by demography, but the age groups, the age brackets. So we use generational brackets, and we also use income as well. And we came up with some. Well, the survey presented some incredible numbers on what young people are doing. To perhaps talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it wasn't for no reason that we ended up segmenting based on age and income. What we do is we say, what matters is consumption levels of seafood. And so let's figure out what most drives that. Is it race? A little bit. Is it location relative to coast? Yes, somewhat. We looked at lots of variables, but the things that drive it the most or predict it the most are, in fact, age and income. And what we found is, the younger groups, meaning millennials and Gen Z, particularly in the middle and high income, consume 3 times more seafood than the older segments, particularly in the lower incomes. And so we found age matters and income also matters. And I'd be happy to talk about why that is, but it's fascinating how different the consumption profiles are by segment.
Yeah, let's just lock in on the young people for a second. That was the big one for me. When we came up with these numbers, the numbers were really quite remarkable on what young people were doing. It went a little bit against, for me, logic. I had this working assumption, and I've been to many conferences where people in Norway will talk about what the American market looks like, and we tend to think of older consumers eating salmon in restaurants. So when these amazing numbers came up on the millennials, that was really kind of surprising. So what's your best take on what's going on?
Indeed, we dubbed the millennial the super consumer because of the quantities of seafood that they're consuming at home. I think health is at the center of this. So the millennials are particularly interested in and willing to invest in maintaining their health and protecting their health for the long term. And the reason is because they've had parents and grandparents in the older generations who they've watched work themselves to the grave or to an early grave. And so they don't want to do that. They want to enjoy their life more. They want to have a quality of life for a longer period of time. And so they really focus on health. And seafood enjoys very good reputation with respect to health, and it could be related to the omega-3s and oils and salmon and so forth, but there's many reasons seafood is associated with health. I think that's the centerpiece, and there's other pieces that wrap around it, but I think that's what drives the interest in seafood. And as I mentioned during COVID, there was an increased experience with seafood, and so that also helped to build the momentum.
Right, because it's not, for anything that we saw, the lowest income millennials and Gen Zs are actually eating more seafood than the wealthiest in the oldest groups.
That's right.
Which is really quite a surprise.
Right.
But again, it's not. These are not folks going out to fancy restaurants. They're making it at home, right?
That's right. I mean, they may be going out to fancy restaurants, but our focus was around at-home consumption. And so, both are true. The more income you have, the more likely you are to consume more seafood. Mm-hmm. And the older you are, the less likely you are to have seafood at home. And so, you find this sort of sweet spot with the millennials where they're consuming a lot.
Yeah,
they really are.
No, it's super interesting. And how much would you say COVID was a part of this, where everybody was stuck at home and, all of a sudden you've got loads more time and you can get in the kitchen. I remember at the time I was, doing presentations online, and we were guessing that people if they're at home all day, they're just going to get in the kitchen and start trying stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, we know quantitatively that about 25% of those groups are consuming more than they did before COVID, but I think qualitatively it's what you said. I mean, you think about the anecdotes that you hear, people experimenting not just with cooking salmon, but experimenting with new muffins, with all kinds of stuff that they didn't cook before, and posting them on Instagram. They had time and they had interest, and they actually slowed down their lives a little bit. Yeah. And some people got a lot of enjoyment out of that, and now they've learned and brought those habits forward.
Right. Yeah. But that said, at the same time, they're not. What we found, I think, is that people are not making super fancy recipes, right? It's actually the other way around. They're discovering that seafood is quite quick to cook, and you're done in minutes.
Well, it's fascinating. I mean, in this generation, and I'll refer to the millennials as this generation, people don't cook from scratch the way my generation or my parents' generation did. They do what I refer to as assembly cooking. So if they get the piece parts and put it together, that's cooking. Well, seafood is assembly cooking at its easiest. I mean, 60%, something like 60 or 70% of people, when they're cooking a piece of fish, it's literally put it on the heat, shake some salt and pepper and lemon flakes on there, and it's done. And it's super easy, and it delivers. People are so happy with the results. They're like, "Oh, I'm a success. I'm a good cook. I'm going to do it again." You know.
Yeah, I remember we had one statistic about how many people would repeat that dish when they've tried it for the first time.
Yeah, almost
and it was
almost everybody was repeating these dishes. They find one,
super high.
Everybody likes it. It's a winner. It's healthy, and they just do it again. Something like, it was 87% of the recipes that we surveyed were repeats because they were good.
Right. So we talked a little bit about young people doing eating seafood. But they're not eating seafood exactly in the same way as older people, right? So you've talked a little bit about sushi, but it does seem to be everything's done in a different way, and even sushi's done in a different way. I think older people, you and I would have eaten sushi 20 years ago in quite a fancy restaurant. This is not the way younger people are eating sushi, right?
Well, sushi now is super accessible and safe. I mean, you can go into most supermarkets and know that the sushi is going to be not only safe but good quality, and that certainly was not the case in past generations. And so if you grew up in a world that, first of all, that sushi is weird, I mean, if you're older, raw fish is weird in the first place,
right?
And then you're like, well, I would only want to eat it if I'm watching the chef slice it off the fish, because otherwise it could have been sitting there, I could catch something. But people under 35 or 40, they're like, no, sushi, if they're selling it, it's safe because they wouldn't be selling it otherwise, and it's everywhere. I mean, you can get sushi everywhere. It's the fastest growing, I think it's the fastest growing category in the supermarket. I mean, we looked at some Kroger information. It's amazing.
Yeah. And we have a little bit of our own data on sushi trends as well.
We certainly do. And we looked at not only do you like sushi, but when we specified, do you like a wide variety of raw fish? We're not talking about eggs and cucumber. We're talking about raw fish. And like, people love it. People love sushi. And again, that fascinatingly is what's driving experimentation with other types of cooked seafood at home as well.
Yeah, so George, just to finish off the point about health as well, health obviously is a big factor. Actually, I've got two questions on health, which I'll get to. I want to talk about it on a species level because that's super interesting. But first of all, some of the buzzwords you hear these days, flexitarianism, right? So this is kind of flexitarianism, right?
Yeah, I mean, flexitarianism means people who agree with the following statement: I try to eat a more plant-based diet. So it is not strict. It is not, I do not eat meat, I do not eat eggs, I do not eat milk. It's none of those things. It's just, I try to eat a more plant-based diet. Well, what does that have to do with fish? There's two drivers of this phenomenon. One is health. One is people feel like a more plant-based diet is healthy. Seafood is healthy, so they're consistent with one another. I think the other piece is environmental. And regrettably, beef has got a really bad name right now. And people think cows are the new coal and they don't want to eat beef. And so they say, well, what other proteins are they? And they go into this calculus around the environmental impact of all types of protein. And seafood, depending on your opinion, depending on the consumer's particular opinion, it's good or okay, but it's a lot better than beef. So those two drivers both contribute to growth. Yeah.
So there's flexitarianism, and then there's the pescatarian one, which curiously not many people identified as being pescatarian.
That's right.
There were very few.
In this market, it's unusual. Yeah, very, very few. So which is to say people who eat fish as their only animal protein. Very few people are in that category.
Bizarrely, this morning I was reading that Dolph Lundgren, the actor, has turned pescatarian.
All right.
But he does scrambled eggs and fish, which is clearly salmon. But anyway, an aside. The other question on this is one I have on health, because it's quite an interesting one. So when we started to talk to consumers, we're getting them to conjure up some of the things that they feel, their sort of subconscious thoughts. And we segmented it by the different three of the main species, which are salmon, shrimp, and tilapia. And the salmon ones, there was a lot of it that was about health, right? It's the omegas, and at the same time, the seafood industry's seen this incredible increase in the amount of capsules and the doing omega in pills. But with shrimp, there was a different dynamic. Not many people were talking about health. And so there's different things going on there. Like
let's start with the commonalities, okay? So
Yeah.
if you let me just talk a little bit about how we did the research, and then I'll talk about the commonalities. So we asked each of the qualitative interviews that we did, the 61-hour-long interviews. We asked the person to spend an hour making a collage to express their thoughts and emotions about seafood, but not to show any pictures of actually seafood. And the reason we don't want pictures of seafood is we want them to use other types of images to bring out their emotions and metaphorically. And
so just to give a little bit of color to what George is saying, we got things like you would have stormtroopers for farm fish and all sorts of crazy stuff. But then you'd have positive things as well.
Oh, yeah. You'd have palm trees, and you'd have family gatherings, and you'd have, elegance and fancy restaurants, fit people. You'd have all kinds of, beautiful sunsets, little cabins with rowboats by the ocean, all kinds of stuff. And not a fish to be seen, because that was the rule. You can't show seafood.
Yeah.
So there was a few categories of themes that came out of this. One is around health. We've talked about that. One is around romantic notions of fishing. People have this image of a fisherman going out at the crack of dawn with the seagulls flying around and just enjoying his life so much as a fisherman and bringing the fresh catch back to the dock. So there's all versions of that. There's versions of beach holidays, and particularly tropical beach holidays. And that one tended to tilt more towards shrimp, because that's where people often enjoy shrimp, in the Caribbean or Thailand, or whatever. And there was certainly a category around this being a special, a little bit more high-end, a little bit more expensive type of food, and that matches up with also that it's seafood is associated with family gatherings and sort of special times with friends and family. So these are the positive sort of associations and themes that we saw. But there was also what we sometimes call the dark underbelly, or the misgivings that people have about seafood, either through their education or miseducation about seafood. So people are concerned about the state of the oceans. They're concerned about the healthfulness of farmed seafood, about things that they have read or heard that there could be forced labor involved in trawling ships or illegal trawling, those kind of things. So most people have a little bit of a hesitation, as well as all those very positive attributes associated with seafood. And yes, it is true that those little themes vary by seafood type, as I mentioned with shrimp, but there are more commonalities than there are differences.
Yeah. It does seem that salmon is really in the glow of the health trend, and it's got the omega thing the omega-3 seems to be super powerful.
It's very well known. It's very well known, and people associate omega-3 with heart health, and they associate omega-3 with salmon. It's a very easy equation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the shrimp industry doesn't seem to be in that glow as much.
They're not in that glow, and they also have the shadow of maybe an older perception or misperception that there's a cholesterol issue with shrimp.
Yeah.
I don't know the facts of the matter, and the facts of the matter don't count as much as what consumers believe, and so that pulls shrimp back a little bit. I think it's surmountable, but it's something to overcome.
And a little aside as well, not quite part of something that came up in our survey was we'd often, in those 60 interviews you mentioned at the beginning, a lot of people, we'd ask them, what types of seafood do you consume? And they would say, oh yeah, I eat this fish and I eat that.
Salmon, cod.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then they'd say, and then sometimes, we'd ask, and do you eat shrimp? So, oh yeah, I eat shrimp, and exactly that thing happened the other day. I was in a restaurant in Charlotte, in downtown Charlotte. And I remember distinctly the waitress said, yeah, we got some nice seafood items. We got this fish. And if you don't want any seafood, we got some lovely shrimp. I was like, there it is again.
It's almost
what is going on in this country?
People think of
shrimp?
It as a different category. I wonder if people translate the word seafood in their mind into the word fish. Mm-hmm. And they think of shrimp differently. But literally, they think of everything as seafood, and then there's another category thing called shrimp. It's really interesting.
Yeah.
Certainly, lobsters and clams are on the seafood side, but shrimp is its own thing. It's really fascinating.
It's a funny one.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm going to drag this conversation back into June 2024.
Yep.
We're in the middle of a cost of living crisis. I've been in New Hampshire and on this trip in North Carolina. I've seen lots of shuttered restaurants, people evidently struggling with the cost of living.
Yeah.
I frequently look at seafood prices, so I've seen them coming down. Salmon prices do tend to come down at this time of year with farmed. But how can the findings of our report be applied to now where there is this cost of living crisis and people are feeling the pinch? And we are talking about more expensive proteins, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, as you know, that we did in the report is to analyze the relative cost to the consumer of various seafood items versus various alternative type of proteins. And the seafood basket is considerably more expensive. Mm-hmm. I think when it comes to people's health, they generally are more willing to pay what it takes to keep themselves healthy, and that's the reason organics exist. I mean, they cost considerably more, and yet some people still buy them. I think there could be a channel shift away from restaurants towards in-home. In other words, the European dynamic that you expressed earlier may be starting to happen here, where people are saying, rather than spending much more money at a restaurant, I'll spend a little more money and eat seafood at home. So that could be happening. Right. But there could also be some pulling back. Certainly, it's as they say in economics, it has a downward sloping demand curve. So if it gets more expensive, people are going to have to shift away a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, 10 years ago, the Norwegian salmon industry sold exclusively to the European market. And what they would tell the bankers is that this is a counter-cyclical economy. Because when most salmon's eaten is a midweek meal in most northern European countries, and when the economy is not so great like it is right now, people will not go to a restaurant. They'll make a fancy, like a slightly more elegant meal with salmon or something like that. So consumption actually tends to go up. And that's the interesting thing, isn't it? That is, as the US seafood market seems to be transitioning to a much more significant at-home market, that we might start to see some of these trends.
We've talked a lot about salmon and shrimp. I'll mention something about tilapia, which is interesting. I mean, a lot of people recognize tilapia as good, clean, affordable seafood protein. I mean, people liked it. But for those people who grew up poor and they associate it with their mom was a single mom, she had no money, this is all she could afford, that seems to overcome the fact that they actually really like the fish. And as an adult, they shy away from it. Now, many people did not have that childhood experience, but it's something that we discovered for people who did. They're not going back to tilapia. They've left that town. You know?
But would that be more? Is a little bit more part of this premiumization trend in the last few decades, right? Like if you go to, I think peak tuna, canned tuna demand was early 1990s, and now it's all about these big monospecies, and they are more expensive than canned tuna, right?
That's right, and it's a different experience. A fresh fish fillet is a very different experience than canned tuna. I mean, we've talked about this. This is a fresh and frozen seafood report, but we have made some observations about what's going on in canned fish, and there is a little bit of a premiumization going on there as well, as we explored in a couple of case studies.
That's right. Yeah, there's a super interesting thing going on there with the posh cans and a very unusual trend with younger people, and which is a lot of fun.
Tinned fish date.
Tinned fish date, yeah. No, I'll give some kudos here to Emily D'Souza who pointed that one out to me.
That was fantastic.
That was very good. So just on this health topic, seafood does seem to have this slightly aspirational, because when people talk about their health, there is this aspirational element to it, right? And if you talk about, if you say to somebody how many times do you eat seafood, it's like saying, how many times do you go to the gym?
Yeah.
And there's a disconnect. And I was listening to some of the presentations at a seafood conference the other day, and that happened in Norway. And somebody just brought up this topic, so I've got it really top of mind at the moment. So the disconnect between what people say they do and what people actually do, right?
It's fascinating. When it's a product or an activity which is deemed healthy or positive, people exaggerate, and when it's deemed unhealthy, people minimize. I mean, I go to the doctor and they say, how many drinks do you have a week? And I look at my shoes. So, but the running one is a good example. If you ask people how often do you go to the gym, they'll say, I go twice a week. And if you say, when did you actually go to the gym last? They go, well, I was really busy last week. It's been a couple of weeks. And so that dynamic is also at play with seafood. So when we ask people, how often do you eat seafood a week? They'll tell you, when you add it up, it's 80 times a year at home, 80 times a year, so almost twice a week, which doesn't make sense to us when we looked at the numbers. But when we said, what's the last time you actually had seafood at home, and we add all those up, what we realize is it's more like 40 times a week. Actually, 40 times a week for the millennials and less for some of the other groups, which makes a lot more sense. So that little story illustrates that people consider seafood to be healthy. They're wanting to exaggerate the quantity that they consume.
So talk us through a little about how we used that understanding and we baked it into the questioning that eventually ended up in our market sizing exercise.
Absolutely. I mean, if you do a simplistic market survey and say how many times a week do you eat seafood, how many times a week do you do anything, you know that there's going to be noise there. So we deliberately used that question, how many times a week do you have salmon, how many times a week do you have shrimp, how many times a week do you have tilapia. We used that data to get the relative market shares of the different types of fish. But we used a different question to figure out actual frequency, and that question was the one I mentioned before. When's the last time you bought seafood and consumed it at home and prepared it at home? And when you do that over a large sample size, it doesn't matter if some people's experience is typical of their habits and others is atypical. It comes out in the averages. And so we used that information to figure out frequency and the former information to figure out mix between species. So I'm getting a little detailed on that, but there's some analytics required. Yeah,
the analytics. So what I'd like you to just talk about very briefly is how those analytics then actually translated into the final the numbers where we were able to size up the market per age group, per income level.
So let's still talk a little bit about segmentation. So when we talk about there being different segments in a market, what that means is that those are groups of consumers who have behavior that is similar to one another in the segment and different from the behavior in other segments. And so in order to do that, you have to define behavior, which we did. Our definition of behavior is how frequently do you consume seafood at home? Do you prepare and consume seafood at home? And so we calculated that all, and we figured out, as discussed earlier, that there's a different frequency by age, there's a different frequency by income. But, if you're selling fish, you want to know how many pounds people are consuming. And so we then took that frequency information by segment, and we said, well, good. We got a dozen segments. How many people are there in each segment? Well, we have population data from the U.S. Census and so forth. We calculate that. And then we calculate out pounds per serving, and we actually can carve up the 3 billion pounds of seafood consumed by segment. So if you want to go after the millennials, you'll learn that even though they're only a third of the population, they're half of the seafood. So, and that's the reason we did all that analytics in the report, because people who are marketers need some quantification around what the opportunity is.
Right.
Yeah.
That's very good. And we've talked a little bit about the age groups, the generations. Mm-hmm. So we kind of divvied it up into Gen Zs, millennials, Gen X, and baby boomers and older. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about the other part of it, which is the income level. Yeah. I mean, it's really not that much of a surprise that you would see much higher seafood consumption for higher income earners, right?
I mean, there's two dynamics at play. One is direct and one is indirect. So the direct dynamic is seafood costs more than other protein. So if you're on a limited income, you're going to have to consume less of it and more of something that's cheaper. That's a direct impact. There's a secondary level, which is the following. Whenever the way new food items get introduced into the at-home diet is through the restaurant trade, and typically at the high-end restaurant trade. And something might get introduced, like sriracha sauce, and over a long period of time, 7 or more years, it may migrate into the home. If you're a lower-income person, you're not eating out. You're not going to restaurants as much, so you're not exposed to that, and you're not saying to yourself, I might try that at home. So there's double reasons why income matters in this industry.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. But one of the most interesting things is that, in this cost of living crisis, people are migrating to cheaper proteins. So we see that if you look at the USDA chicken numbers, they're great. I think Americans are consuming, that there was a threshold that they broke recently. I can't remember which number it was. But the seafood industry is not exactly 100% correlated with that trend. Now there are other dynamics at play. The salmon industry, there is an industry supply shortage which plays into the price numbers, but it's not exactly correlated, is it, with income? There are other things going on.
Yeah, as we said, I mean, the big trends are, generally speaking, the higher the income, the more seafood people consume, and the older you are, the less seafood you consume. So you mash those together, and you can figure some things out. But there's other undercurrents, if you will, that impact why people do what they did. And environmental concerns was one of the topics we went into in quite some depth.
Some people said in the interviews that I don't buy seafood because of my environmental concerns, but there also seem to be an awful lot of people who still buy seafood while they harbor all of these environmental concerns. How much do you think the seafood industry is really losing out on these people who think that it's farmed horribly, for example?
I think what the seafood industry should hope for is that all future generations consume as much as millennials do. And what we're seeing right now is that the Gen Z, so the younger group, are consuming a little bit less than the millennials are. Not as little as baby boomers or Gen X, but a little bit less. Whereas based on what we've talked about, you'd expect them to consume more. Now, why is that? Why are they consuming a little bit less than the millennials? This is the generation where environmental concerns are most acute and people are most informed or misinformed. I mean, you can get misinformed easily on social media, and you can get informed easily on social media.
Right.
And I think the burden of understanding the state of the environment and how fishing may be impacting the environment adversely, and people seeing stories and good and bad about fish farming, it's really putting a damper on that younger generation. And if we can't educate the Gen Z and younger generations, then they're never going to consume as much as millennial. Now, the other thing is that health concern doesn't matter so much when you're 25. When you're 35, you start thinking about it. And so I think the importance of health will naturally lift seafood consumption as people age.
That for sure. But I think as well, one of the things that surprised me most about the report was that when we were in the middle of COVID and we were asking questions of everybody, what's going on, we heard that people were all of a sudden taking care of their health and they were eating healthier, eating more fish.
Right.
But it transpires that there was a lot of millennials doing that. So it wasn't necessarily 40-year-olds thinking, I'm going to get a heart attack in next week.
I think that, again, they're looking at their parents' generation and saying, my parents didn't look after themselves. They worked too hard. They didn't eat well. They didn't exercise. They smoked too much, whatever it is. And they didn't have a good ending years of their life. They didn't have a good health in their retirement. So I'm going to invest proactively in my health in my younger and middle years so that doesn't happen to me.
Yeah. No, for sure. I mean, it makes total sense. I think one area of the report that perhaps we didn't get quite into was that we analysed as well the buying process and how people behave in the store.
Sure.
And do they go and peruse the items? There's a fish counter there. Do I go and look at the the fresh and then the frozen? I go back to the frozen again.
Yes.
And we did all those types of exercises.
We certainly did.
And what we concluded was something a lot more straightforward. That
people go in with a plan. So let's talk about what buying process means. Sometimes in marketing we talk about it as the customer journey. So what are all the steps from the time that the idea comes to you that I'm going to buy some seafood for dinner or I'm going to buy a new car, whatever it is, all the way till you actually purchase it. And there's quite a lot of steps actually in seafood if you break it down. So it's what am I going to have for dinner? Do I have a recipe? Do I write a recipe down? Do I have to have a shopping list? Which store am I going to go to? Is my regular store? Am I going to compare prices across stores? There's a lot of steps, and we analyzed all that. But what we found is they go to the store already with an idea that I'm buying seafood. Generally, they go straight to fresh or straight to frozen to get what they want. And there's some people who go compared to the other one, but no one goes back and forth comparing prices. It's generally purpose-driven, mission-driven. And even though it's special, it's also routine enough that they're not going to pause and deliberate in store. They're going to get what they want, put it in their basket, and get out of there. So if you're trying to introduce a new cut or a new type of seafood to get people to experiment, you have to hit them before the moment that they're sitting at home saying, I'm going to the grocery store. You have to plant the idea. And of course, these days that happens through social media. That's where people get exposed to new recipe ideas.
Right, right. So chefs, influencers.
Honestly, chefs and influencers, yeah. I mean, certainly a quarter of people learn to cook out of cookbooks, and that's amazingly even true today. But mostly chefs and influencers and people, and even on TikTok, people are getting recipe ideas. So
yeah,
it's changed a lot.
It's so much easier to follow one of these video recipes, right, than following a written. I've got a bunch of cookbooks, and I love my cookbooks, but there's nothing like watching one of these videos.
Well, because
watching it happen.
Because you watch it and you realize how simple it is, you don't have to write a recipe down. So no one's writing a recipe down. Very few people are writing a shopping list down. They just have it in their mind. They can remember that video, and they go to the store and say, now what did they put in there? What do I need? And just boom, boom. It's 2 or 3 things. It's not a lot of things.
Yeah.
Simple cooking.
Yeah. And I think as well, it would be amiss not to mention the packaging trends, because the fish counter for 99.9% of folks, even me, and having worked in this industry for years, is kind of intimidating. It's an intimidating spot.
That's right.
And we've seen this huge skim packing trend where it's all moving to skim packing. So it's kind of like
explain what that is.
Skim packing is when you have basically it's vacuum packed,
right.
and you'll buy it just like you buy a packet of beef or chicken, and you can pick it up, you can feel it, you can touch it, you kind of know what you're buying.
Yeah.
And also, it's vacuum wrapped, so it doesn't smell in your fridge, right? I mean, in your cooler, that seems to be a big deal.
It satisfies needs of the consumer as well as needs of the supermarket. So the consumer likes to touch things. Mm-hmm. They want to touch and feel it. But they also don't like the notion that someone's breathing on all that fish and it's been out in the air. And even though it's a glass counter, what if someone sneezed? People don't like that. So the consumer likes that. And the supermarket likes it as well, because then you need less labor on. You don't have to have skilled fish cutters on staff. You have pre-packed, and it's there's less waste, and so everybody's happy.
Yeah. No, it makes a whole bunch of sense. Yeah. So we'll wrap this one up shortly, but one question I would have for you, and I actually haven't asked you this in any off camera or on, but
right.
What was the most surprising part of the report for you in the findings? What came up at you? It's like, my word, I wasn't imagining that.
Honestly, I think it was the apprehension and the contradictions that exist in the consumer's mind. It's like, oh, I love seafood. I think of the 7 fishes at Christmas dinner. I think of my vacation in Thailand. I think of when I went to Maine and the beautiful fishing boats and all these positive attributions. But the depth and how visceral the concerns are about the environment, and a lot of people really don't like the notion of fish farming, even if they don't know anything about fish farming. Mm-hmm. And those concerns are real, and they do steer people away from the category into it's just too hard to think about. I'm just going to get chicken, and so that was a surprise to me. And I think it's something that. To overcome that, you probably have to focus on the positives, but it's a real factor in this industry.
Yeah, and just to be clear to everybody who's listening, we were not looking at the food service sector, so this is not about going into a restaurant and ordering something. This is about the at-home thing, which seafood's new for a lot of people cooking at home, right? So
that's right. Yeah, I mean, because people didn't grow up cooking, people don't know how to cook. Young people don't know how to cook. They are apprehensive about something that's going to be complicated, that's not going to come out right, and that was expensive to buy. And so when they do salmon or even shrimp, it's easy, it's fast, it comes out great, everybody loves it. So success breeds success. But if you're selling another type of seafood other than salmon, shrimp, and tilapia, you also have to teach people how easy it is to be successful.
I think if I was to ask myself the same question, I would say, in actual fact, I think the thing that surprised me the most was the fact that people were cooking it in a really simple way. I just thought, I kind of always have in my mind people making fancy dinners. And I used to, that's been a little bit of my own journey as well over COVID. I think I would make seafood in a more fancy dinner. I ended up in COVID, cooking for two boys, just getting my grill pan that I was just talking about and just doing salmon in just a couple of minutes. They both eat it. And actually, it was quite interesting that there was people talking about their children and what their children are willing to eat. And that's a big deal. Like when they look at a piece of fish, they're kind of like, ooh, but salmon tends to kind of salmon, I'll eat that.
Exactly. For children, salmon's a different category of thing from seafood, right? Salmon I'll eat, seafood I won't, right? So children tend to like it. But one thing was interesting is that I anticipated that when people do a seafood recipe, it's one thing. Like you talked about, they buy salmon, they grill it, they do it with vegetables or rice, whatever it's going to be.
Right.
But what we found is many people are doing recipes that involve more than one type of seafood, even though the cooking method is very simple.
That was
very interesting.
An interesting one.
And as you know, there's a lot of quantification in this report. So all these themes that we're talking about in this conversation qualitatively have data behind them in the report, so people can figure out exactly what percent of people are cooking in what way. But that was fascinating. So many people are doing recipes that are multi-seafood recipes.
When we talked a little about the collages and the mind of the consumer and getting people to give these subconscious thoughts expressed in a bunch of Google images and coming up with all this random stuff. Mm-hmm. How can that information be actionable and helpful to the seafood industry?
People made all these collages, but it was our job to synthesize that into something that's more like a map of the mind of the consumer, which we have done in a simple infographic that's in the report and has the themes that we've talked about here. But you need to realize that when the consumer walks into the supermarket, there's two things going on. There's a lot of romantic and positive associations and emotional associations that they bring with them, and there's also the cut and dry practicalities of, I'm here for dinner, I know what I'm getting. I'm getting a pound of shrimp to make that recipe I saw on TikTok this morning, and it's going to be in and out. And so you need to both if you want to encourage the consumer, you need to be dialing up a recollection of those emotional associations at the moment that they're in the store, and you have to be directing them before they get to the store if you want them to change their behavior.
That's awesome.
It's been a pleasure, Matt.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I'm so glad we got to do this. I won't bore everyone with the logistics on this, but we managed to pull it off, and
all right, well, maybe next time we'll have to do it in New Orleans or somewhere else.
Yeah, well, I'd be quite happy to come back to Peabody if I have the nice setup here. So that's fantastic. I'll just, I don't want to turn this into a sales commercial, but you can find our reports via Undercurrent News, one of the most recognized media brands within the seafood industry worldwide, on the report section. And we'd also, as authors of the report, be very happy to take any questions that you have, anything that you want to talk about specifically.
Absolutely.
That's great.
Thanks, Matt. It's been great.
Yeah, no, okay. Thanks very much. It's been a good one.
We'll do it again.